The morning mist clung to the twisted branches like the ghosts of fallen soldiers, and Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison knew that death was waiting in the tangled wilderness ahead. It was May 5, 1864, and the Army of the Potomac was about to march into what would become known as the most brutal opening to any campaign in the American Civil War. General Ulysses Simpson Grant had arrived from the West with a reputation forged in victory, but the Virginia wilderness would test every ounce of his resolve. The dense forest stretched for miles, a labyrinth of second-growth timber, thorny underbrush, and forgotten logging roads that had been reclaiming the land since the iron industry had moved on decades earlier. Here, in this green hell, visibility extended barely 20 yards in any direction, and the advantage of superior Union numbers meant nothing when armies could not see each other. Until they were close enough to taste each other's breath, Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he rode alongside the massive column of blue-clad soldiers. The 118th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment marched in formation, their rifles gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. Behind them stretched an endless snake of humanity. Over 100,000 men of the Army of the Potomac, with their wagons, artillery, and dreams of finally ending this war that had already consumed 3 years of American blood. General Robert Edward Lee had been waiting for this moment. From his headquarters, the Confederate commander had watched Grant's movements with the calculating eye of a chess master. Lee understood the wilderness better than any Union general ever could. He had fought here before, at Chancellorsville, where he had delivered one of his most stunning victories against Fighting Joe Hooker. The terrain that seemed to favor no one actually favored the defender who knew its secrets. The Army of Northern Virginia, though outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, held positions that transformed the wilderness into a fortress. Confederate soldiers had spent weeks preparing concealed positions, creating fields of fire through the undergrowth, and establishing supply lines through paths that Union scouts would never find. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps was still marching from the southwest, but Lee had decided he could not wait for their arrival. As the morning sun climbed higher, Morrison noticed the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. Birds that should have been singing had fallen silent, as if nature itself sensed the approaching storm. The only sounds were the steady tramp of marching feet, the creak of leather equipment, and the occasional whispered order passed down the line. Grant had planned this campaign with meticulous care. According to contemporary accounts from the National Archives, his strategy was simple in concept but complex in execution. He would use his superior numbers to engage Lee's army in continuous battle, preventing the Confederate commander from using his tactical brilliance to achieve another stunning victory like Chancellorsville or Gettysburg. This was to be a war of attrition, and Grant believed the Union could sustain losses that would cripple the Confederacy. The first shots rang out at approximately 11:30 in the morning, shattering the forest's silence like breaking glass. Morrison's regiment was still in column formation when the firing began somewhere ahead. Invisible through the green maze, the sound of musketry echoed strangely in the dense woods, making it impossible to determine the direction or intensity of the engagement. Within minutes, the carefully planned order of march began to dissolve into chaos as regiments tried to deploy from column into battle line while navigating through undergrowth that seemed designed to snare every piece of equipment and trip every soldier. The Battle of the Wilderness had begun, and it would prove to be unlike any engagement in the war. The forest erupted into a hellscape of smoke, flame, and screaming lead as Morrison's regiment struggled to find their enemy in the green labyrinth. The carefully drilled maneuvers that had been practiced on open parade grounds became impossible nightmares in the tangled undergrowth of the wilderness. Soldiers found themselves firing at muzzle flashes barely visible through the smoke, never knowing if they were shooting at friend or foe. Brigadier General Charles Griffin's division of the 5th Corps had encountered Confederate forces under Major General Richard Herron Anderson near the intersection of the Orange Turnpike and Brock Road. What should have been a straightforward engagement became a surreal battle, where regiments became separated from their brigades, companies lost contact with their regiments, and individual soldiers found themselves fighting private wars against enemies they could hear but not see. The undergrowth was so thick that artillery became virtually useless. Cannons that could devastate formations in open country found their shells exploding harmlessly in the treetops, sending deadly wooden splinters raining down on Union and Confederate soldiers alike. Battery commanders who had trained their crews to work with mathematical precision found themselves trying to aim at targets they could not identify in terrain that made it impossible to move their guns once they had unlimbered. Morrison ducked as a Confederate volley tore through the leaves. Above his head, the bullets making a sound like angry hornets as they passed. He had lost sight of his company commander 10 minutes ago, and now he was leading a mixed group of soldiers from 3 different regiments who had somehow found each other in the chaos. The battle had no front lines, no clear objectives, just a series of desperate encounters between small groups of men who stumbled into each other. In the green maze, the heat was becoming unbearable. The temperature had risen to over 80 degrees, and the thick canopy trapped the humidity like a greenhouse. Soldiers who had marched through the cool morning now found themselves gasping for breath in air that seemed too thick to breathe. Uniforms became soaked with sweat, and the acrid smoke from thousands of muskets hung in the still air like a poisonous fog. General Grant had established his headquarters near the Lacey House, trying to maintain control of a battle that seemed to be fighting itself. Reports came in from his corps' commanders, but they were fragmentary and often contradictory. Major General Governor Kemble Warren's 5th Corps was engaged along the Orange Turnpike, but Warren could not determine the strength or positions of the Confederate forces opposing him. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps was moving to support Warren, but their progress was slowed by the same terrain that was making the battle impossible to control. On the Confederate side, General Lee faced similar challenges. His army was spread across a wider front, but the wilderness that concealed his positions also made it difficult for him to coordinate his attacks. Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps was engaged with Warren's 5th Corps, but Hill's men were exhausted from their march and struggling to maintain their lines. In the confusing terrain, the fighting intensified as more units became engaged. The crash of musketry became continuous, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the shouts of officers trying to maintain some semblance of order. The forest floor, covered with decades of fallen leaves, began to smolder from the sparks and wadding from thousands of musket discharges. Morrison found himself crouched behind a fallen log, with a young private from Maine whose face was blackened with powder smoke. The boy could not have been more than 16, and his hands were shaking as he tried to reload his rifle. The Confederate position was somewhere ahead, marked only by the continuous flashes of gunfire through the smoke. "Can you see them, sir?" the private asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of battle. Morrison peered through the undergrowth, trying to make sense of the shadows and smoke. The enemy was close. He could hear their officers shouting orders in the distinctive accents of Virginia and North Carolina, but the exact location of their battle line remained a mystery. This was warfare reduced to its most primitive elements, where courage and determination mattered more than tactical sophistication. The Battle of the Wilderness was evolving into something unprecedented in military history, a fight where the terrain itself became the greatest enemy of both armies. The acrid smell of burning leaves mixed with gunpowder smoke as Morrison realized that the forest itself had become an enemy. Sparks from musket fire had ignited the dry undergrowth in dozens of places, and small fires were beginning to spread through the accumulated debris of decades. The temperature, already oppressive, began to rise as flames crept along the forest floor, consuming everything in their path. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps had finally reached the battlefield, but their arrival brought more confusion than relief. Hancock, known throughout the Army as Hancock the Superb for his tactical brilliance, found himself commanding a battle he could not see. His corps was moving along the Brock Road, trying to connect with Warren's 5th Corps, but the dense forest made it impossible to maintain proper alignment between units. The Confederate forces were experiencing similar difficulties. General Lee had positioned himself near the Tapp Farm, trying to coordinate the movements of Hill's 3rd Corps and the arriving elements of Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell's 2nd Corps. Ewell, who had lost a leg at Second Manassas, was struggling to deploy his divisions in terrain that seemed designed to frustrate every military principle he had learned at West Point. Morrison's improvised command had been reinforced by stragglers from other units, creating a force of nearly 50 men from a half-dozen different regiments. They had established a rough defensive line behind a natural depression in the ground, but the Confederate pressure was increasing. Through the smoke and undergrowth, he could see the distinctive red battle flags of Virginia regiments advancing through the trees. The sound of the battle was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in 3 years of war. In open country, battles had a certain rhythm: volleys of musketry, the boom of artillery, the organized cheers of charging infantry. Here in the wilderness, the sounds blended into a continuous roar broken by individual screams and the crack of burning timber. Men were fighting and dying within yards of each other, but the battle had no coherent pattern, no clear beginning or end to individual engagements. Private Timothy O'Brien from the Irish Brigade had somehow found his way to Morrison's position, his green flag torn and bloodied but still carried with pride. O'Brien brought news that made Morrison's blood run cold. The forest fires were spreading rapidly, and wounded men who could not crawl to safety were being burned alive. The screams of these trapped soldiers added a new horror to a battle that was already unlike anything in military history. General Grant, still at his headquarters near the Lacey House, was receiving reports that painted a picture of chaos. His carefully planned offensive was dissolving into a series of unconnected fights between small units. The advantage of superior numbers meant nothing when those numbers could not be concentrated against identifiable targets. According to records preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Grant's frustration was evident in his dispatches to Washington, where he struggled to explain a battle that defied conventional military description. The forest fires were becoming a major factor in the battle. Entire sections of the battlefield were being evacuated as flames consumed the underbrush, creating new obstacles and forcing both armies to constantly adjust their positions. The smoke from these fires, combined with the powder smoke from thousands of muskets, reduced visibility to only a few yards in many areas. Morrison watched in horror as a wounded Confederate soldier, unable to move from his position near a burning thicket, was consumed by flames that no one could reach through the intense heat. The incident crystallized the nightmare quality of this battle. Men were not just fighting each other, but fighting the forest itself, which seemed determined to destroy anyone who entered its domain. As the afternoon wore on, the battle began to settle into a pattern of sorts. Small groups of soldiers would advance through the undergrowth, encounter enemy forces, engage in brief but vicious firefights, and then withdraw or be reinforced depending on the outcome. There were no grand maneuvers, no sweeping cavalry charges, no concentrated artillery barrages, just hundreds of individual struggles for survival in a forest that had become a burning maze. The wounded presented a particular challenge. In open country, stretcher bearers could quickly evacuate casualties to field hospitals, but in the wilderness, wounded men often lay for hours in the undergrowth, calling for help that could not reach them. The forest fires added urgency to these rescue efforts. As men raced against time to save comrades before the flames could reach them, the second day of battle, May 6, 1864, dawned with an ominous red sky that seemed to reflect the carnage below. Morrison had spent the night in the forest, listening to the moans of wounded men and the distant crackle of fires that continued to burn. Despite the morning dew, his makeshift command had been reinforced during the night, and now he led nearly 70 men from various regiments who had gravitated toward his leadership. In the chaos, Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps had finally arrived on the battlefield, marching through the pre-dawn darkness to reach their assigned positions along the Orange Plank Road. Longstreet, Lee's most trusted subordinate, brought with him some of the finest fighting units in the Confederate Army, veterans who had fought from First Manassas to Gettysburg and had never known defeat when properly led and positioned. The sound of renewed fighting reached Morrison's position as Longstreet's men struck the left flank of Hancock's Second Corps. The attack came at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the forest floor. and caught the Union forces in the process of reorganizing their lines. The Confederate assault was devastating, rolling up several Union regiments and threatening to split the Army of the Potomac in two. Hancock, caught off guard by the intensity and direction of the attack, struggled to reorganize his scattered divisions. The Second Corps, which had been the most successful Union formation on the first day, found itself retreating through the same tangled undergrowth that had protected them 24 hours earlier. The forest that had been their ally now became a trap, as regiments became separated and companies lost contact with their parent units. Morrison received orders to move his men toward the sound of the heaviest fighting, but the message was delivered by a young captain whose uniform was so torn and blackened that his unit identification was impossible to determine. The breakdown in communication had become so complete that orders were being passed by word of mouth between strangers, with no way to verify their authenticity or accuracy. The forest fires had continued to spread during the night, creating new obstacles and dangers. Entire sections of the battlefield were now impassable due to the flames, forcing both armies to constantly adjust their positions and plans. The smoke from these fires, combined with the morning mist, created visibility conditions that made coordinated military operations virtually impossible. As Morrison's men moved through the forest, they encountered scenes that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Wounded soldiers from both armies lay scattered through the undergrowth, some calling for water, others for their mothers, and too many silent forever. The forest fires had created a new category of casualty, men who had been wounded in the fighting but then consumed by flames before help could reach them. The orange plank road had become the focus of the most intense fighting. This narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for a wagon, was the only clear avenue of approach through the forest, and both armies recognized its strategic importance. Confederate forces held strong positions on both sides of the road, while Union troops attempted to advance along its length under devastating fire from enemies. They could not see Longstreet's attack had been brilliantly conceived and executed. By moving his corps through the forest during the night, he had achieved complete surprise and struck the Union forces at their most vulnerable moment. The attack demonstrated that even in the chaos of the wilderness, superior leadership and planning could still achieve decisive results. Morrison found himself commanding a desperate rearguard action. As his men covered the retreat of more organized units, the Confederate pressure was relentless, and the forest seemed to amplify every sound. The crash of breaking branches, the shouts of officers, the screams of wounded men, and the continuous crack of musket fire. His men were exhausted, hungry, and running low on ammunition, but they continued to fight with the desperate courage of soldiers who knew that retreat was the only alternative to death. The battle for the Orange Plank Road would continue throughout the day, with attacks and counterattacks flowing back and forth along the narrow corridor. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage, but the cost in human life was staggering. The road itself became carpeted with casualties, and the dirt was stained red with blood that mixed with the morning dew. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable once again, and the forest fires continued to spread, creating new challenges for both armies. The afternoon of May 6th brought a dramatic turn of events that would alter the course of the battle. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, riding at the head of his advancing troops along the Orange Plank Road, was struck down by friendly fire from his own men. The incident occurred when Longstreet and his staff, returning from a reconnaissance mission, were mistaken for Union cavalry by nervous Confederate soldiers who fired into the group through the smoke and undergrowth. Morrison, positioned several hundred yards away, heard the sudden eruption of gunfire followed by confused shouts and the sound of horses in distress. The wounding of Longstreet created immediate chaos in the Confederate ranks as the general, who had been orchestrating their most successful attack of the battle, was carried from the field with a severe wound to his throat and shoulder. The loss of Longstreet's leadership was immediately felt throughout the Confederate forces. Major General Charles William Field attempted to assume command of the First Corps, but the momentum of the morning's attack had been broken. The Confederate soldiers, who had been advancing with confidence under Longstreet's direction, suddenly found themselves without clear orders or unified command structure. General Lee, upon learning of Longstreet's wounding, rode forward to personally take control of the situation. The sight of their commanding general moving toward the front lines inspired the Confederate troops, but it also demonstrated the desperate nature of their situation. Lee's appearance in such a forward position indicated that the battle had reached a critical point where conventional command structure was breaking down. Morrison observed the Confederate attack lose its coordination and intensity. The sustained pressure that had been threatening to break the Union lines began to weaken, allowing Hancock's Second Corps to stabilize their positions and begin organizing counterattacks. The forest that had been such an obstacle to organized military operations now provided concealment for Union forces attempting to regroup. The wounding of Longstreet became a turning point not just in the battle, but in the entire war. According to military historians referenced in Shelby Foote's comprehensive Civil War narrative, Longstreet's injury prevented what might have been a complete Confederate victory in the Wilderness. His tactical genius and ability to coordinate complex operations in difficult terrain had been the key to Confederate success, and his absence left a void that no other Confederate general could fill. The afternoon fighting continued, with reduced intensity as both armies struggled with exhaustion, ammunition shortages, and the continuing challenge of the forest fires. The blazes had now consumed large sections of the battlefield, creating smoke so thick that soldiers could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. The heat from these fires, combined with the oppressive humidity, made physical exertion almost impossible. Morrison's men had been fighting for over 30 hours with minimal rest, food, or water. Their uniforms were torn and blackened, their faces streaked with powder smoke and sweat, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Yet they continued to hold their positions, knowing that any retreat might expose other Union units to devastating Confederate attacks. The forest itself had become a battlefield casualty. Acres of woodland that had stood for decades were now burning ruins, and the wildlife that had once inhabited these woods had either fled or perished in the flames. The wilderness, which had seemed so alive and threatening at the beginning of the battle, was being transformed into a smoking wasteland of charred stumps and ash as evening approached. Both armies began to realize that the battle was reaching a stalemate. Neither side had achieved their strategic objectives, and both had suffered casualties that would take months to replace. The Confederate Army had failed to destroy Grant's forces, while the Union Army had been unable to break through Lee's defensive positions. The wounding of Longstreet had saved the Army of the Potomac from potential disaster, but it had also cost the Confederacy one of its most capable commanders at a crucial moment in the war. The incident demonstrated how quickly the fortunes of war could change, and how individual leaders could influence the outcome of massive battles. Night began to fall over the burning forest, bringing with it the sounds of wounded men calling for help and the distant crackle of fires that continued to consume the woodland. The Battle of the Wilderness was entering its final phase, but the cost in human life and suffering had already exceeded anything either army had experienced. In 3 years of war, the night of May 6, 1864, brought no relief to the exhausted armies locked in combat within the burning forest. Morrison crouched behind a fallen oak tree, listening to the sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The screams of wounded men trapped in the spreading forest fires, the crack of burning timber, and the distant sound of digging, as both armies prepared for what they knew would be another day of slaughter. The forest fires had created a new dimension of horror that neither army had anticipated. Wounded soldiers who could not crawl to safety were being consumed by flames that advanced with merciless inevitability through the dry undergrowth. The sound of their screams echoed through the darkness, a reminder that in this battle, nature itself had become an enemy more terrible than any human foe. Union and Confederate soldiers found themselves cooperating in desperate attempts to rescue wounded men from the advancing flames. In some areas, informal truces developed as soldiers from both armies worked together to carry injured comrades to safety. These moments of shared humanity provided brief glimpses of compassion in a battle that had otherwise stripped away all civilized restraint. General Grant spent the night at his headquarters, reviewing reports from his corps' commanders and trying to determine his next move. The battle had not gone according to his plans, but he was not ready to admit defeat. Unlike previous Union commanders, who had retreated after suffering heavy casualties, Grant was preparing to continue the campaign. His decision to push forward, rather than withdraw, would mark a turning point in the war on the Confederate side. General Lee was also planning his next moves. The wounding of Longstreet had been a severe blow, but Lee's army remained intact and in strong defensive positions. He understood that Grant was different from previous Union commanders. This general would not retreat after one setback, and the Army of Northern Virginia would need to be prepared for a prolonged campaign. Morrison used the relative quiet of the night to reorganize his men and redistribute ammunition. His improvised command had grown to nearly 100 soldiers from various regiments, all looking to him for leadership in the chaos. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, but they maintained their positions with the grim determination of veterans who had survived 3 years of war. The darkness was filled with the sounds of military activity as both armies prepared for the coming day. Engineers were clearing paths through the forest, artillery was being repositioned wherever possible, and supply trains were attempting to reach the front lines with ammunition and medical supplies. The logistical challenge of supporting large armies in such difficult terrain was enormous, and both sides were struggling with shortages of everything from food to bandages. Medical personnel faced unprecedented challenges in treating the wounded. Field hospitals had been established in whatever clearings could be found, but the forest fires often forced these facilities to relocate, sometimes carrying wounded men on stretchers through smoke so thick that the bearers could barely see where they were going. The usual procedures for battlefield medicine became impossible when the battlefield itself was on fire. The psychological impact of the battle was beginning to show on both armies. Soldiers who had fought bravely in open country were struggling to cope with the claustrophobic terror of fighting in a burning forest, where death could come from any direction. The normal support structures of military life, clear chain of command, reliable communication, predictable tactics, had all broken down in the wilderness. Morrison walked among his men, checking on their condition and trying to maintain morale. He found soldiers from the Irish Brigade praying the rosary, Pennsylvania farm boys writing letters home by the light of burning trees, and hardened veterans sitting in silent contemplation of what they had witnessed. The diversity of the Union Army was evident even in this small group, but they were united by their shared experience of surviving the wilderness. The night also brought the grim task of counting casualties. While exact numbers were impossible to determine in the darkness and confusion, it was clear that both armies had suffered terrible losses. Regiments that had marched into the forest with full strength were now reduced to scattered companies, and some companies had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. As dawn approached, the forest fires continued to burn, sending columns of smoke into the morning sky. The wilderness had been transformed from a green labyrinth into a blackened wasteland. But the battle was not over. Both armies were preparing for what would be the final day of fighting in this hellish terrain. Knowing that the outcome would determine the course of the war, the morning of May 7, 1864, revealed the full extent of the devastation that had been wrought in the Virginia wilderness. Morrison stood at his position behind the charred remains of what had once been a thriving forest, surveying a landscape that looked like a vision of hell. Blackened tree stumps stretched as far as the eye could see, and the air was still thick, with smoke from fires that continued to smolder in the distance. The third day of battle began with a strange quiet. Both armies were exhausted, depleted, and uncertain about what the day would bring. The continuous fighting of the previous 2 days had taken a terrible toll on both sides, and many soldiers wondered if they had the strength to continue. Morrison's men, now reduced to about 80 effectives, prepared their weapons with the mechanical precision of veterans who had learned to function. Despite their exhaustion, General Grant faced the most important decision of his career. Previous Union commanders had withdrawn after suffering heavy casualties in battles with Lee's army, but Grant had no intention of retreating. His decision to continue the campaign, moving south toward Spotsylvania Courthouse rather than north toward Washington, would signal a fundamental change in Union strategy and demonstrate his determination to see the war through to its conclusion. The Army of the Potomac began to disengage from the wilderness during the morning hours. Units that had been locked in deadly combat for 2 days carefully withdrew from their positions, always maintaining contact with the enemy but avoiding the kind of major engagements that had characterized the previous fighting. The process was complicated by the terrain, which remained as difficult to navigate as ever, and by the need to evacuate thousands of wounded men. Confederate forces, initially uncertain about Grant's intentions, gradually realized that the Union Army was not retreating, but rather moving to continue the campaign in a different location. This realization brought both relief and concern to Lee's army. Relief that they had survived the wilderness fighting, but concern about what Grant might attempt next. Morrison's unit was among the last to withdraw from the battlefield. As they moved through the devastated forest, they encountered scenes that would remain with them forever. The bodies of soldiers from both armies lay scattered among the burned trees, many so charred by the forest fires that their uniforms and identities were no longer recognizable. The wilderness had claimed its victims without regard for which side they had fought for. The casualty figures from the Battle of the Wilderness were staggering. The Union Army had lost approximately 17,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate losses were estimated at around 11,000. These numbers represented not just military statistics, but thousands of individual tragedies. Young men who would never return home, families who would never see their sons and husbands again, and communities that would bear the scars of loss for generations. The battle had achieved none of the strategic objectives that either side had hoped for. Grant had not destroyed Lee's army, and Lee had not driven the Union forces back across the Rapidan River. However, the battle had demonstrated important truths about the nature of warfare and the determination of both armies to continue fighting, despite enormous costs. As Morrison's men marched away from the wilderness, they passed columns of wounded soldiers being evacuated to field hospitals. The medical challenge of treating so many casualties in such difficult conditions had pushed Union medical services to their limits, but the dedication of surgeons, nurses, and stretcher bearers had saved thousands of lives that might otherwise have been lost. The Battle of the Wilderness marked the beginning of the Overland campaign, which would continue for 6 weeks as Grant and Lee maneuvered their armies across Virginia. In a series of increasingly desperate battles, the wilderness fighting had set the tone for this campaign. It would be a war of attrition, with both sides accepting enormous casualties in pursuit of their strategic objectives. The forest itself would eventually recover from the devastation of the battle. New growth would emerge from the ashes, and within a few years, the wilderness would once again be covered with vegetation. However, the memory of what had occurred there would never be forgotten by those who survived the experience. Morrison, now a brevet colonel after his performance in the wilderness, would go on to fight in the subsequent battles of the Overland campaign. He would always remember the Battle of the Wilderness as the moment when the Civil War reached its most desperate phase, when two armies fought each other and the forest itself in a struggle that tested the limits of human endurance. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended, but its legacy would influence the remainder of the war. Grant's decision to continue the campaign despite heavy casualties demonstrated the Union's commitment to victory at any cost, while Lee's successful defense showed that the Confederate Army remained a formidable opponent. The Wilderness had been the stage for one of the most brutal battles in American history, and its lessons would shape the final year of the Civil War. As the smoke cleared and the armies moved south toward their next confrontation, the Wilderness fell silent once more, leaving only the ghosts of the men who had fought and died among its burning trees.